the leaves were beg. The question that lingers, the question that remains unanswered, is not who killed Silas Clay, or why, or even what happened to his body. The answer is a tragedy, a cautionary tale, a glimpse into the heart of a community that chose silence over justice, survival over truth. The question that remains, the question that makes the story of Silas Clay so haunting, is this: what is the line between justice and murder? When does a community's right to protect itself become the very thing that destroys it? The mountains have their secrets, and they have their legends. And now, you know the story of Silas Clay. It is a story of a peddler who came to the mountains seeking a fortune, and found only a grave. It is a story of a community that decided to take the law into its own hands, and was forever changed by the decision. It is a story of a man who discovered the truth about his own father, and was forced to make an impossible choice. But in the end, the only thing we can really know is that in the Appalachian Mountains, a man could be killed for a piece of land, and no one would ever say a word. The silence of the mountains is a deep and ancient thing, a silence that keeps the secrets of the dead. And sometimes, you can still feel it. In the hush of the forest. In the creak of an old cabin. In the wind that whispers through the trees, carrying the ghost of a forgotten peddler, still searching for his way home, not ending to turn in the high country of western North Carolina, the first chill of autumn painting the coves in shades of rust and amber, when the surveyors found what they were not looking for. It was the autumn of 1879, and a crew from the State Geological Survey was working its way through a particularly dense thicket of rhododendron along the banks of a creek that didn't have a name on any map. They were searching for mineral deposits, following a vein of mica that a local trapper had claimed to have stumbled upon. What they found instead was a hole in the ground. It wasn't a sinkhole, which was common enough in the limestone country farther west. This was a deliberate excavation, its mouth overgrown with a tangle of mountain laurel but its sides unnaturally straight. One of the men, a young fellow named Ezra Ponder, leaned in to get a better look and saw the glint of bone. At first, he thought it was a deer. It was the teeth that told him different. The skull was undeniably human, and there was a dark, rust-colored stain on the rock nearby that looked like old blood. The surveyors did not stop their work that day. They were practical men, hard men, accustomed to the harsh realities of life in the southern mountains. But one of them, a man named Isaiah Webb, took careful note of the location and wrote a brief description in his field journal. He wasn't a lawman. He wasn't a detective. He was a man who kept meticulous records, and in the isolated coves of Appalachia, meticulous records were a rare and precious thing. That journal, for a time, was lost. But when it was finally found, decades later, it would open a door onto a forgotten crime, a family secret, and a mystery that had been buried beneath the fallen leaves of 100 autumns. We have to go back. We have to go back to a time when these mountains were still a world apart, a place where the law was often a distant rumor and a man's life could end in a heartbeat, with no one to hear the sound. The story of the Appalachians is the story of America's first frontier, a massive, ancient mountain range stretching from the hills of Alabama to the forests of Maine. For centuries before the arrival of Europeans, it was home to a vast network of indigenous peoples, including the Cherokee, Shawnee, Choctaw, and Creek, who farmed the river valleys and hunted the high country. The mountains were not just a landscape, they were a spiritual and cultural homeland. But the 18th century brought a relentless tide of immigrants, the Scotch-Irish, English, Germans, and Welsh, who poured through the gaps and passes seeking land and independence. They were a fiercely self-reliant people, shaped by centuries of conflict and hardship. They brought their old-world folkways, their music, and their deep-seated suspicion of authority with them. Life in the mountains was a constant, brutal negotiation with nature. The thin, rocky soil yielded a hardscrabble existence, and the isolation bred a fierce loyalty to family and clan. Outsiders were viewed with deep suspicion, and justice was often a personal matter, dispensed at the barrel of a gun. The post-Civil War years were particularly volatile. The region had been a bitter battleground, with families split between Union and Confederate loyalties, and the conflict left a legacy of violence, score settling, and lawlessness. The rise of industrialization, with the railroads pushing their iron tracks into the deepest coves, brought new money and new power, but it also brought exploitation. Timber companies and coal speculators from the north and east began to buy up vast tracts of land, often through fraud and deception, displacing families and stripping the mountains of their ancient forests. This is the world into which our story falls, a time and place where the old world was dying, a new world was being born, and the line between justice and murder was as thin as a mountain mist. This is the world of the forgotten grave. The forgotten grave. It was the clue that no one was looking for, the first piece of a puzzle that would take a century to assemble. It lay not far from the small settlement of Elk Hollow, a cluster of cabins and a single general store nestled in a narrow valley. This was a place of few laws and even fewer records. The county seat was a day's ride away, and the federal courts in Asheville might as well have been on the moon. The people of Elk Hollow kept their own counsel. They knew their neighbors' secrets, but they were a silent people, a people who had learned long ago that in the mountains, a loose tongue could get a man killed. It was in this silence, this uneasy peace, that a stranger arrived in the autumn of 1878. His name was Silas Clay. He was a man in his late 40s, a traveling man by trade, a peddler of tinware and other small goods, a Yankee peddler as they were known, a figure both welcomed and despised for his gossip and his cheap wares. Silas was a talker, a man with a gift for persuasion, and he soon became a fixture in Elk Hollow, staying at the modest boarding house run by a widow named Martha Pruitt. He told tales of the outside world, of the booming cities in the north and the new railroads that were carving up the west. He spoke of opportunities, of fortunes to be made in timber and minerals. But Silas Clay was also a deeply troubled man. He was an alcoholic, prone to violent rages, and his charming veneer would often crack under the pressure of a bottle. The locals tolerated him, as they tolerated most things, with a wary eye. His presence was a disruption, a jarring note in the quiet rhythm of their lives, and in the mountains, a disruption was something to be wary of. One chilly evening in November, Silas Clay was seen arguing in the muddy street with a local farmer named Abel Crenshaw. The argument was over a disputed debt, a matter of a few dollars for some axes and cooking pots that Crenshaw claimed were shoddy. The confrontation was public, loud, and threatening. "You'll pay me what you owe, or I'll have the law on you," Silas shouted, shaking his fist. Abel, a tall, stoic man with a face carved from the same granite as the mountains, simply stared back. "The law," he said, his voice low and cold. "We don't need no outside law here, Mr. Clay." It was a threat in itself, a reminder that in these mountains, a man's word was his bond and a man's life was his own to defend. That night, a group of men gathered at the general store, their voices low and serious. The subject was Silas Clay. The peddler was stirring up trouble, they said. He was spreading rumors, turning neighbor against neighbor, and his drinking was getting worse. He was a wild card, an unpredictable element that threatened the fragile peace of their community. "He's got a real mean streak," one man said. "I saw him beating his horse the other day, just for shying at a shadow." "He's always asking about the land records," another added. "Says he's got a friend in the government who wants to buy up the timber rights. Says our deeds might not be good." This was the real fear, the fear that struck at the very heart of their existence. The government and the outside land speculators had been stealing their land for years, and a man who claimed to know about the law was a dangerous man indeed. The last time anyone in Elk Hollow saw Silas Clay alive was the morning of November 14, 1878. The widow, Martha Pruitt, reported that he had left the boarding house before dawn, saying he was heading to the next county to sell his remaining goods. He was in a foul mood, she said, muttering to himself and carrying a heavy sack of what she assumed was his stock. He walked north, up the road that led into the high coves, and he was never seen again. At first, no one was overly concerned. He was a drifter, after all. A man who lived his life on the road often chose to move on without much fanfare. The peddler's disappearance was the talk of the town for a few days, but the gossip soon died down, replaced by the more immediate concerns of the coming winter. When Martha Pruitt found Silas's horse still in his stable, a good horse that he would not have left behind, a flicker of unease passed through the community. But even that was dismissed. Perhaps he had found another ride. Perhaps he had met with an accident in the woods. There were no letters, no telegrams, no enquiries. the law was never informed. Silas Clay, the traveling peddler, simply vanished into the vast, ancient silence of the mountains. But as the years passed, the story of his disappearance didn't die. It became a ghost story, whispered around fires on cold winter nights. They said that in certain coves, when the wind was right, you could hear the jingle of a peddler's wares. They said that on foggy mornings, a tall, angry man could be seen walking up the north road, his sack slung over his shoulder. The story of Silas Clay became a legend, a warning about the dangers of being a stranger, the dangers of talking too much, the dangers of being a threat to a closed society that valued its secrets above all else. It was in this atmosphere of half-remembered fear that Isaiah Webb's journal found its way to a dusty shelf in the county courthouse, a year after the bones were found. Webb, the surveyor who had documented the grave, didn't make a spectacle of his discovery. He was not a man who sought trouble. But he was a man who believed in order. A few months after the find, he made a quiet trip to the courthouse to file an official report. The county clerk was a busy man, uninterested in what he likely saw as the rambling of a backwoods surveyor. But the journal entry was filed, as was the law, and there it sat, gathering dust, waiting for a different kind of man to find it. That man was a young lawyer named Ezra Bridger. He was an outsider, a recent graduate of a law school in Pennsylvania, who had come south to serve as a clerk in the federal courthouse. It was a terrible posting, a career dead-end for a young man with ambition. But Ezra had a passion. He was a lover of history. He used his access to the dusty records to study the history of the region, and he was fascinated by the hidden stories they told. He was a quiet, thoughtful man who could spend hours sifting through yellowed documents, piecing together the narratives of forgotten lives. It was in this pursuit, in the spring of 1885, that he stumbled upon Isaiah Webb's report. The brief notation was meticulous: November 14, 1878. Silas Clay, Peddler, reported missing. Grave located 2 miles north of Elk Hollow near unnamed creek. Human remains found. Possible connection to earlier reports of a body in that area. No formal investigation. County lacks jurisdiction. Contact county coroner. The entry left Ezra Bridger utterly cold. He knew the story of Silas Clay, the legend was still a part of local folklore. But here, in the official record, was evidence that it was more than just a story. This was a death. And a death without a legal inquiry was a crime. He pulled the other records from the region, looking for a death certificate, a coroner's inquest, anything. There was nothing. It was a legal void, a place where the law had failed to follow. This discovery was his obsession. It was the moment he stepped into a darkness that he could never fully escape, the moment he decided to try to solve the mystery that had been buried in the mountains for almost a decade. Ezra Bridger did not approach his investigation as a modern detective might. He was a man of records, of paper. He began to write letters. He wrote to the county clerk, to the coroner, to the circuit judge, to any official who might have had a reason to know something about Silas Clay's disappearance. He received replies that ranged from the dismissive to the openly hostile. From the county coroner, he received a terse note stating that no inquest had been requested and that the matter was considered closed. From a local politician, he received a warning: "Mr. Bridger, this is none of your concern. We in these parts handle our own affairs. It would be wise for you to drop this inquiry." The refusal to cooperate, the threat, was a blinding light in the darkness. It was proof that he was onto something. He realized he needed to leave the paper and go to the place where the truth lay buried, the coves of Elk Hollow. He traveled to the small settlement, a journey of several days on horseback, and immediately felt the eyes on him. The people of Elk Hollow were not welcoming. They saw him as a representative of the government, the same government that was stripping them of their land, the same government that had failed to protect them from the greed of the railroad barons. They were a closed and suspicious people. He began by asking about Abel Crenshaw, the farmer who had argued with Silas Clay on that final night. The response was immediate and chilling. "Abel died 2 years ago," a storekeeper told him, his gaze flat and unwelcoming. "Took a fever from the woods. He's buried in the family plot." There was no grief in the man's voice, merely a statement of fact. Ezra asked about other names, about other people, but the people of Elk Hollow were silent. It was as if a collective wall had been erected around the memory of the peddler, the stranger who had dared to come into their world and challenge their ways. But Ezra was a persistent man. He had the patience of a scholar and the determination of a man seeking a truth that could redeem a past injustice. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the historical records of the U.S. Department of the Interior. While sifting through federal documents in the Asheville courthouse, he discovered a massive ledger containing land grant records for the counties of western North Carolina. It was a labyrinth of legal claims, forged deeds, and contested boundaries, the very foundation of the region's long and painful history. Nestled within its pages was a claim filed by a Silas Clay for the purchase of a large tract of land over 5,000 acres that encompassed the entirety of the Elk Hollow settlement and the surrounding mountains. It was dated just 3 weeks before his disappearance. According to the claim, Silas Clay had purchased the land for a pittance from a man in Washington, D.C., who had claimed it through a dubious, pre-Civil War land grant. The claim was riddled with legal holes, the deed was a forgery, the transfer was illegal, but on paper, it gave the peddler a terrifying power. He was trying to seize the very land on which the people of Elk Hollow had lived for generations. This was not just a debt. This was an existential threat. He wasn't just a nuisance, he was trying to destroy their entire way of life. The motive for his murder was no longer a mystery. It was a glaring, undeniable truth. The people of Elk Hollow, the people who had built their lives on that land, had been fighting off these land sharks for years. The peddler, Silas Clay, was just the latest, and perhaps the most dangerous, of them. He had to be stopped. The discovery changed Ezra's entire understanding of the case. It transformed it from a personal vendetta into a desperate act of survival, a brutal defense of a community's very existence. Ezra Bridger, armed with this new understanding, returned to Elk Hollow. He sought out an old woman, a midwife named Gertie Hensley, who was rumored to have a long memory. He knew the people of the mountains had a deep and complex belief system, a mixture of Christianity and older folk magic that they called signs, cures, and witchery, a blend of superstition and practical knowledge handed down from their European ancestors. This tradition, this Appalachian cosmology, was a way of understanding the world, of coping with the harsh realities of life in the mountains. And it was within this world that Gertie Hensley lived. Ezra sat with her on her porch. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in a final blaze of color. "I know about Silas Clay," she finally said, her voice as dry as a corn husk. "You'd be wise to forget him. But I'll tell you this. After Silas Clay went missing, there were 2 men, Abel Crenshaw and his brother-in-law, a man named Enoch Birch. They were seen by my daughter heading into the high coves that next morning, carrying a pick and a shovel. They came back hours later, covered in mud. They were quiet. They didn't speak. They didn't look at anyone. They just went home, washed up, and sat down to supper. My daughter saw them." "Did she tell the law?" Ezra asked. "The law," Gertie sniffed. "There was no law in those days. The people of Elk Hollow, they didn't need no law. They had their own ways." "But Abel Crenshaw is dead," Ezra said. "Yes," she replied slowly. "But Enoch Birch, he's still alive. He lives in a cabin 6 miles north, near the headwaters of Elk Creek. He's an old man now, alone. Maybe he'd like to see a friendly face before he goes to his grave." Ezra thanked her and rode the 6 miles to Enoch Birch's cabin in the gathering dusk. The cabin was a small, forlorn structure, half hidden by a grove of hemlocks. An old man sat on the stoop, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as Ezra approached, his eyes pale and watery. "Mr. Birch?" Ezra said, dismounting. "My name is Ezra Bridger. I'm a lawyer. I'm looking into the disappearance of a man named Silas Clay." The old man stared at him for a long moment, his knife frozen in his hand. "Silas Clay," he repeated, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "That name ain't been spoken 30 years. What business do you have with the dead?" The bones were found, Mr. Birch, Ezra said gently. My business is to find out how he died. Enoch Birch's weathered face seemed to crumble into itself. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had wielded a shovel on that cold November morning. Then, he began to tell the story. Silas Clay was a bad man, he said. He had a map from Washington. He was going to take our land. He was going to make us all leave, push us off the mountains we'd lived on for 3 generations. He was a threat to everyone we loved. The day he was killed, it was a decision. Not a crime. It was a decision to protect our families. A group of men, we did what we had to do. A group of men? Ezra asked. Who were they? The old man began to name them. He named them all: Abel Crenshaw, the man with the debt, Enoch Birch himself, the storekeeper, 2 of the farmers, and, finally, the last name hit Ezra like a physical blow. His own father's name. The shock of the revelation was so profound, so complete, that Ezra felt the world tilt beneath him. His own father, a man he had always known as a quiet, gentle farmer, had been one of the men who had killed Silas Clay. Your father, Enoch said, seeing the look of shock on Ezra's face. He was there. He didn't want to be, but he understood. We all understood. Silas Clay wasn't a man. He was a disease. He was a cancer that needed to be cut out. He was a man, Ezra managed to say, his voice trembling. He was a peddler. He was someone's son. He was someone's father. He was a land thief, Enoch said, his voice hardening. He was a Yankee trying to take everything we had. We did what had to be done. We took him up to the cove, and we put him in the ground. We buried him deep, so no one would ever find him. It was a secret we all carried. You just murdered him, Ezra repeated. It wasn't murder. It was justice. It was the way things were done. It was a decision we all made. The old man shrugged, a gesture that echoed the indifference of the community. And then you all just went on with your lives, Ezra said. As if nothing had happened. Ezra Bridger returned to Asheville a changed man. He had gone looking for a crime and found his own family's shame. He was the son of a man who had helped to murder an innocent stranger. He had the confession. He had the names. He could go to the authorities. He could have the men arrested, have them tried for murder, even though the crime was decades old. He could finally bring the story of Silas Clay to light, to the justice of a court of law. And he knew he couldn't do it. What would be the point? The community of Elk Hollow was as much a victim as it was a perpetrator. They were a people desperate to protect their way of life, driven to extreme measures by a corrupt and failing system that had been stealing their land and their dignity for decades. Silas Clay's death wasn't a simple murder, it was a symptom of a deeper rot, a failure of justice that had allowed men like him to threaten and dispossess the people of the mountains. But as he sat in his office, surrounded by the records of a century of injustice, he understood the final, brutal irony. Ezra Bridger's discovery was not a triumph. It was a tragedy. He had found the truth of his father's past, and in doing so, he had been given a terrible choice: to destroy the community that had raised him, or to keep silent, protecting a secret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This was not a story of good and evil. It was a story of survival, of the violence that lies just beneath the surface of civilization, a story of a forgotten grave and a forgotten crime. In the end, Ezra Bridger did nothing. He put the journal back in the courthouse vault. He never spoke of Enoch Birch's confession. He never told his father that he knew the truth. He carried the secret to his own grave, a silent, haunting burden that defined the rest of his life. But the story of Silas Clay was not a simple murder. It was a consequence. It was the culmination of a long, bitter conflict over land, a conflict that had been raging for generations. It was the story of a man who was a stranger, a threat, a disease that needed to be cut out. The mountains, in their vast, indifferent silence, had kept the secret for over 100 years. They had hidden the bones of the peddler, and they had hidden the truth of what had happened to him. But the truth, even when buried, has a way of seeping out.